It's my pleasure to introduce the Honourable Scott Morrison, the Treasurer of Australia, and particularly pleased that this is the second year in a row that we're doing this, and I hope it becomes an annual event. Along with Jim, I'd like to thank the AAA, so Jennifer and Debbie, I can see her, for all their cooperation for this event, and congratulations to Alistair on his recent appointment. This is the Treasurer's third ministerial position, having previously been the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection and also the Minister for Social Services. I think the title of the speech today says a lot, and it's certainly resonated with investors here this week at other meetings, that there are better days ahead, and it's great to get some clarity, I think, around the sometimes political noise that we hear coming through newspapers and so on. I'd like to thank the broader Treasury team as well. I know the schedule this week has been pretty tough. They were in Washington only yesterday, back up to New York just to do this event, and then back to Washington, obviously, again for the G20 and the IMF. So I think it's fantastic that they've made the effort to come to New York. This is a very important location for us. There's a lot of connection to Australian investors and global investors interested in Australia. So without further ado, I welcome the Honourable Scott Morrison to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be back here at City. And Jim, thank you very much for your hosting us here today and throughout the meetings we held earlier today. Also to Jennifer, thank you, and AAA, and had a very lovely note from Ambassador Berry, who's a good friend, and we miss him back in Australia, but I know he's doing great work here with AAA, and so please pass on my best regards to him as well. And of course, Alistair, congratulations in coming into the role, and I wish you all the best for that. And your background commends you well to a room like this, there's no doubt about that. And I look forward to future visits, and it's always good to come back up and be in New York and have the opportunity to engage, particularly with investors and other regulators and those involved in the markets, to get a first-hand perspective before heading down to the G20 and the IMF, where there'll be a whole range of other perspectives, I suspect. But to talk directly to those involved in the markets, I find enormously helpful. There is no doubt that the United States has been a powerful force in shaping the economic future of what is a very capital-hungry nation in Australia, always has been. And international investment has fueled our ambition and has enabled us to reach our potential, and continues to do that. We are a capital-hungry country. From the barrels of rum that sailed into Sydney Harbour aboard the aptly named trading ship Hope in 1793, our total two-way trade is now more than $63 billion, and our total investment is now worth more than $1.47 trillion. The US is both Australia's largest single investor and the largest destination for Australian investment. And what's more, the amount of investment has grown sizably since the financial crisis. Over 860 billion Australian, and total US investment in Australia has increased threefold since 2002. At around $195 billion Australian, the stock of US direct investment in Australia is more than that of any other country. And this investment has created 330,000 high-paying jobs with an average salary of more than 115,000 Australian. And on the flip side, total Australian investment in the US was valued at $617 billion at the end of 2016, and that's a figure which has doubled since 2005. So it's a pretty tight relationship and a pretty mutually beneficial one. And like anywhere else, though, Australia, and like here, Australia has not been immune from the battering forces that have hit economies around the globe over the past decade. What began as the global financial crisis, and I know that's referred to differently here as the Great Recession, has become what I call a long-running global economic funk of low inflation, low rates and low growth. And this has been a hard economy to find yield in and to boost earnings. In a tough global environment, Australia has been an economic standout. Despite the challenges we've all faced, the Australian economy has now chalked up a record 26 years of consecutive annual economic growth. There's no nation that's been able to achieve that on established records. And that backs up the judgment of global capital in Australia, and particularly here in the US, that we have and remain a very sound place to invest. Australia has the second highest GDP per capita of the G20, second only to the United States. Our success is grounded in being an open trading economy with a strong and resilient banking system, and one that has always sought to maximise our opportunities. Our traditional strengths and resources in agriculture continue to be embraced while actively diversifying our economic base by transitioning our manufacturing industries and also rapidly expanding our services sector that now makes up around 60% of our economy. The Australian economy grew by 0.8% in the June quarter, and that took our annual growth to just under 2%. We expect real GDP growth to track back up to 2.75% over the rest of the financial year, and before returning to growth of around 3% in 18-19 and subsequently. Now, our confidence in the better days that we see ahead for Australia is not just driven by our view, which has been reinforced here over the last few days, of an improved global outlook, but the flow of what has been some good domestic data in recent times, including the strongest period of job creation we've seen in decades. Now, we've had now 11 consecutive months of jobs being created, and there has not been a longer run of jobs growth in Australia in 23 years. In the past 6 months, we saw the strongest gain in jobs since the Sydney Olympics, and more than 250,000 Australians taking a risk and being rewarded with a job. And the vast bulk of these have been in full-time positions. The growth in employment is expected to continue, with job advertisements and surveys expecting employment to remain on that growth trend. And with this sustained pickup in employment conditions, it's no wonder that businesses also are reporting the best conditions they have seen in almost a decade, and that was confirmed again this week in the NAB monthly survey, which put business conditions at rock solid. And of course, we also saw a tick up in confidence. The Westpac Institute Consumer Sentiment survey also showed a pickup in consumer confidence, which once again means there are more optimists than pessimists on the Australian economy, which is a welcome development in recent days. And our recent economic results, while they're particularly pleasing, they're particularly pleasing because we have endured what most economies have had to deal with over the past decade. The global financial crisis did not sidestep the Australian economy like it did here in the US or across Europe. Now, that was particularly thanks to the strength and resilience of our financial system. That did not fail. But our greater challenge has been the prolonged and somewhat painful exit from a once-in-a-century mining boom that both helped our country prosper on the way up, but has left our economy with a hangover that still hasn't quit. So when you're looking at the Australian economy, while most of the world looks at the global economy through the prism of the Great Recession or the global financial crisis as being a critical issue, in the Australian economy it's actually been our journey through the transition of the mining investment boom. Commodity prices that began to soar around 2004 on the back of a demand shock driven by the expansion of China. Resource companies received a substantial income boost which flowed through to the wider economy. Our exchange rate appreciated beyond parity with the US, giving consumers significant purchasing power. Mining investment inevitably followed the soaring commodity prices, reaching a peak of around 9% of GDP. And when there was little spare capacity in the economy and unemployment was low, naturally wages and incomes began to grow at a rapid pace. Now, this sudden orientation to mining effectively split our economy in two, as labour and investment were diverted to mining and away from other sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing, which were also weighed down by higher exchange rates, making them less competitive, and the higher wages needed to attract labour. But this plane on the mining investment boom was always going to land. Following the peak of the commodity price boom in 2011, we saw a 30% reduction in our terms of trade as commodity prices retreated rapidly. Mining investment also began to dry up and the income boost that the country had been receiving went into reverse. And over the 4 years following the peak of the mining investment boom, private non-mining, non-financial profits had been declining at an average rate of 1.9% per year between September of 2012 and 4 years later to September 2016. Now that drag has been a significant anchor on the Australian economy and it's handicapped gains for half a decade. From its peak, mining investment more than halved from the 9% to around under 4% of GDP, and on average knocked almost a full percentage point off real economic growth per annum. Now the impact has also been felt by households, courtesy of subdued wage growth. At the start of the mining boom, our measure of real consumer wage moved sharply away from the producer wage, which is wages relative to the prices firms receive for their output, which continued to grow in line with productivity. Now, as it stayed away, with the gap increasing over the coming years, producer and consumer wages tend to move together, and we hadn't seen that happening. However, since the peak of the boom, the consumer wage has spent 5 years now moving sideways, with the producer wage and productivity playing catch-up. As the adjustment from the end of the mining investment boom continues and spare capacity in the labour market is absorbed, we can expect upward pressure on wages to resume, in line with productivity growth and investment, like a normal transmission will be restored. So you can see we've been in a holding pattern on wages and an investment that has weighed down any economic momentum we have been able to achieve. Only now has the vast majority of that investment boom washed out through the system and the drag on our economy is almost complete. This is most recently evidenced by the welcome pickup in non-mining investment in the last few quarters and surveys of capital expenditure intentions suggesting growth of around 5% this financial year, which had previously been estimated at -2%. So there's quite a turnaround we're seeing in the non-mining components of our economy. But despite a brighter picture emerging within our economy and a renewed sense of optimism, within the global economy, complacency will be an enemy. We cannot afford to rest on our laurels and sit back and wait for growth to magically fall from the sky, and the Turnbull government in Australia is certainly not doing that. As a government, we have been unashamedly prioritising growth strategies that we know will boost our economy and deliver a well-earned pay rise for Australian workers and lift our living standards. To grow our economy, just like here in the US, we must have a competitive tax system that encourages our businesses to expand, invest and embrace new opportunities and to innovate. Across the globe, the principle of cutting business taxes to drive growth and investment is the emerging economic consensus. Those failing to act and reduce the burden on businesses risk becoming isolated and uncompetitive in an increasingly low-tax global marketplace. In its World Economic Outlook released this week, the IMF made this point as well. In modelling 15 percentage point reductions in corporate tax rates in the US, Germany and France, the IMF found the resulting impact of greater investment would have large benefits for the reforming countries. And for those countries refusing to jump on board tax reform, the IMF warned of significant negative spillovers on activity and fiscal positions. Now, as a government, we get this, and we have already legislated, passed through our parliament, progressive tax cuts for businesses with a turnover of less than $50 million a year, taking their tax rates down from 30% to 25% over the next decade. And just to give you some sense of that, those firms employ more than half the Australian labour force. And we're now doubling down on that initial process with our enterprise tax plan that would see those tax cuts extended to all businesses in Australia. And our Treasury estimates that cutting our corporate rate from 30 to 25 would generate a sustained lift in GDP of over just 1%. And we're investing on top of that in nation-building infrastructure with a pipeline that will boost productivity across all of our states and regions. In this year's federal budget, I announced a 10-year $75 billion infrastructure program. The plan is unprecedented in scale. It benefits every state and is set to deliver a productivity boost across the country that will further support our thriving jobs market. The centrepieces of this program include our $5.3 billion Western Sydney Airport development, and that doesn't include the associated infrastructure on road and rail that would also be supporting that investment. That's $8.4 billion also for the Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail. And our commitment to infrastructure also extends to major energy projects through the Snowy Hydro scheme, with a significant investment which will see the creation of the largest pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. Now that's 350,000 megawatts of electricity a week, and that's enough to power and service demand continuously for 500,000 homes. So that's a major renewable addition to our energy capability. And the results of our public infrastructure investment program we're already seeing. Public investment in our national accounts approached 9% growth in the June quarter, and there is much more to come. And the same is true for defence investment. The Turnbull government has embarked on Australia's largest recapitalisation of our defence forces since the Second World War. We are returning defence spending to 2% of GDP by 2021, and that's 3 years ahead of our original commitment. As a member of Australia's National Security Committee of Cabinet, I know how important this is to our allies, particularly here in the US, as we continue to stand together, as we've done now for 100 years on battlefields around the world, that centenary to be celebrated next year, to protect the freedoms and values which our two nations hold in unison. But it's also important to our economic partnership in defence industries. For example, Australia sits on both sides of the Joint Strike Fighter project. We are both the purchaser, but we're also an important part of the supply chain. And it's not just in this project where we act in that capacity. And it's not just in defence, but it's also in national security. Our cooperation extends to these projects as well. Domestic security, cyber security, border protection, and related projects are consuming larger parts of our budgets. And my last two budgets alone, I've committed $2.7 billion to additional domestic security initiatives, which require significant investments in upgrading, whether it's everything from the gates that you go through at our airports to the comms infrastructure and other security infrastructure we have across our various agencies. So Australia's defence and security industries are up for this very big task of doing and providing the best level of support and services. And we want to work with the best, and they are here in the United States. And that means expanding our commercial partnerships in both security and defence industry here within the United States. To protect against these better days ahead, to ensure that they're there, we also have to be preemptive and forward-leaning in addressing the risks that are there for our economy. The presence of risk doesn't suggest weakness in our economy. It just identifies that as a proactive manager of our economy, we are keen to understand what those risks are and get ahead of them. And there are three of those that I would like to discuss today. Firstly, Australia's household debt. Now, it does remain high, with around 80% of the $2.1 trillion of household debt that we have tied up in mortgages. This is a real risk, if not properly managed, and as a government we get that. Australian households are now the fourth most indebted in the OECD as a share of disposable income, behind Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway. At 122% of GDP, our household debt is roughly 2/3 higher than the average ratio in advanced economies. But these figures must be understood in the context of the factors that mitigate against these risks. Firstly, on average, Australian households have 5 times asset coverage over the value of their debts. Total household wealth last quarter reached a record $9.8 trillion, or almost $400,000 per person, with the value of their assets being predominantly in housing. While Australia's housing markets, especially our largest cities, have experienced strong growth over the past decade, this of itself is not evidence of an underlying weakness in our housing asset values, nor that a hard landing for our housing markets is ahead. Australia's housing values, while high, are still real. Safe as houses actually still broadly means something in Australia. The rise in housing values has been driven principally by the genuine economic forces of supply and demand, where mortgages are subject to full recourse finance, supported by a strong, stable and resilient banking system and the world's best practice credit standards, in our view. Low or no-doc loans that cripple US housing markets are a rarity in Australia. More recently, housing supply has been tracking ahead of population growth, where it is beginning to pull on the reins of house prices as it makes ground on years of undersupply, as you can see from the chart. Two occasions when we have seen considerable price pressures in homes in the last decade have both coincided with periods when the construction of new homes simply wasn't keeping up with population growth. In the last 4 years, supply has moved ahead of population to now build the strongest cumulative growth in stock in a quarter of a century. This increase in stock is now working its way through the backlog, and there remains a strong pipeline going forward. In this year's budget, I announced additional measures to ensure supply keeps up with demand in the future. We're now working with our provincial governments to improve the responsiveness and forward planning of the zoning and regulatory approval system. Now, this includes providing tax incentives for affordable housing investment through managed investment trusts that would be of real interest to US pension funds, and providing a 50% withholding tax reduction from 30 to 15% for such investments, including development projects. Where the supply-demand imbalance has been exacerbated by investors seeking to capitalise on rising prices, we have also taken action through our prudential regulator, APRA, to constrain access to credit. This action has included restricting credit growth for investors to 10% for our bank lenders, and the proportion of new interest-only loans to 30% of total new residential property loans. The combination of interest-only loans in a low-rate environment escalates the risk that homeowners will build up price to secure a property rather than restrict their exposure. The regulator's actions have taken targeted action to address this risk. They have also had the effect of increasing the rate spread between principal and interest-only loans. Currently, for the major banks, rates for owner-occupied principal and interest loans are around 100 basis points lower than for investor interest-only loans. Now, these measures have had the effect of releasing investor-fuelled steam from the market, encouraging mortgage holders to convert to principal and interest loans and to pay down debt and create more room for owner-occupiers, including first homeowners, to get back into the market. And further measures to lift lending standards, including stricter guidance on loans with LVRs at or above 80%, and new applicant repayment capacity assessed at around 200 basis points higher than the offer rate. Since setting a cap on interest-only loans, the growth of investor lending has continued to moderate, growing at just 0.4% in August, and the equal slowest result in the past 17 months. And our banks have rapidly approached the 30% cap on new interest-only loans, down from a peak of 46%. As observed by Moody's in their credit rating report last month, when they once again maintained Australia's AAA credit rating, they said APRA's proactive prudential policies bolster the resilience of the banking sector and mitigate the risks of high household debt. And the proof is in the pudding. Capital city house prices rose only 0.3% in September to be 8.5% higher through the year. Sydney house prices declined 0.1% in the month, the first monthly decline in around 17 months. APRA's measures, which have the full support of the government, are actually working to smooth the landing in our housing markets. And we take together the unique characteristics of Australia's housing markets and the actions of our regulators, making comparisons, frankly, of rising housing prices in Australia with the housing investment bubbles that have been seen elsewhere, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, I would say are grossly misinformed. But there are other factors that are also assisting Australia to manage our high levels of household debt. Households have taken advantage of the low interest rate environment to get ahead of their mortgage and create a buffer. Mortgage holders in Australia have the equivalent of over 2.5 years of mortgage payments in offset accounts. And for the 1/3 of households who do not have a buffer, these include those who have just started their loan, those on interest-only loans who now face a stronger price incentive to convert to principal and interest and pay down debt, or those on a fixed interest loan who often face a penalty for early repayment. Finally, our debt concentration is also in higher income households, with the top 2 quintiles holding around 60% of Australia's mortgage debt. And so managing household debt, it is a real issue. We keep a close watch on it, as you can see, but the factors I've outlined hopefully put the housing markets in an informed context. It's like the Oscars. Hopefully it's not that bad. I don't think we'll talk about Hollywood today. Moving moving on to some of the areas of risk. Any discussion of the Australian economy will almost always turn to a discussion about China and the Asian region, and China is our largest trading partner and a key source of growth for our economy. Asia's giant rapid urbanisation has had a profound effect on the Australian economy. Our iron ore and coal has fuelled the Chinese steel industry that has been the linchpin for China's development, allowing its sprawling cities to embrace 500 million rural residents in the last 3 decades. But the risks to the upside that have borne so much fruit for our economy can be just as sharp on the downside, particularly as our largest trading partner undergoes some necessary structural reform, as it seeks to wean itself off investment-led growth and boost private consumption and become a consumer-led economy while reining in its debt. The IMF estimates that augmented government debt in China is likely to rise to 91.5% of GDP in 2022, while the broader measure of public and private debt is projected to increase to 296.7% of GDP in the same year. This high level of debt has intensified the risk in China's financial system, particularly amongst lower-tier banks and in the shadow banking sector, where the size and quality of debt remains more opaque. The Chinese central bank estimates that bank off-balance assets, are around 110% of their total balance sheet assets. With the Chinese government steadfastly committed to its growth target of 6.5%, this is likely to be exceeded this year. And with the economy growing at 6.9% in the first half of the year, there is concern that this will further increase debt. So as you can appreciate, the path of reform is never going to be a smooth one. Pleasingly though, these risks are something the Chinese government has acknowledged and is attempting to contain as it seeks to provide stability to our regional economy. Last month I was in Beijing to lead Australia's strategic economic dialogue with China, and in our discussions there was a very candid assessment of China's challenges. Creating 13 to 15 million jobs a year to prevent unemployment from rising is not an easy task that the Chinese government has before it. China generates more jobs in just over a week than we do in a year. In these discussions, China openly discussed their credit management challenge, as well as the need to make their SOE sector, as they said, more fit than fat. And they also highlighted the need to ensure their tax system encouraged investment. China has steadily begun tightening macroprudential and regulatory measures and is committed to increasing its analysis of capital markets and the asset quality within its banks. Nonetheless, it still has a few further tricks up its sleeve, including its domestic saving rate of 45%, its adequate levels of foreign exchange reserves, and the fact that the authorities have overall control of the system. But while Chinese authorities have further significant tools to manage risk, they will need to find a balance between stability and growth-enhancing reforms to generate productivity. Now, given this perennial risk to our economy of a slowing China, our government has actively sought to expand and diversify our trade relationships, including acquiring new partners and broadening relationships with existing partners, deepening them. An empowered Chinese middle class are presenting us with plenty of opportunities to diverse our trade, going beyond the iron ore and coal shipments that have long been the bedrock for this relationship. We are well placed to deliver financial, education, health and aged care services to meet the increasing demands of a changing and ageing Chinese society. And those new trade opportunities also build upon the strength we have in our agricultural exports, wool exports to China, which were valued at $2.4 billion in 16-17 and up 20% from the previous year. And while there is a whiff of protectionism in the air, given the current political upheaval across the globe, Australia has done the opposite in an attempt to open up new trade routes. That means new free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, Peru, and the potential of an FTA with Indonesia, our closest neighbour, all of these presenting lucrative opportunities. For instance, the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation predicts a 70% increase in food production that will be required by 2050 to meet global demands. That's an extra 1 billion tonnes of grain and an extra 200 tonnes of meat, million tonnes, I should say, of meat. And the real value of food consumption alone in Indonesia will increase fourfold by 2050. So these opportunities are right on our doorstep, and it gives us the opportunity to diversify. Now, the final area of risk I wanted to talk about was those which are even more directly within control of the government, and they relate to our fiscal position and our banking system. The reason Australia was able to withstand the body blows of the GFC was because of the prudent budget management of my predecessor, a few removed, Peter Costello, who by the time he left office in 2007 was running budget surpluses in excess of $19 billion. Now, 6 years later, we returned to government and we inherited some $240 billion in accumulated deficits and a generation of debt. Having implemented more than $100 billion of budget repair measures and reduced average real growth in government expenditure to below 2%, which is the lowest of any Australian government in 50 years, we are on track to return the budget to balance in 2021. Similarly, we have reduced the growth in debt by 2/3, and for the first time in almost a decade, from the 1st of July next year, we will no longer be having to issue Commonwealth Government securities to meet recurrent expenditures. We are achieving this by having a responsible path back to budget balance, not a mad scramble of austerity that would put economic growth at risk in this climate. You don't want the medicine to kill the patient. This is a pathway the OECD recognises appropriate and the IMF affirmed as appropriately prudent. The fiscal discipline led to all three major ratings agencies maintaining their AAA credit rating for Australia, one of only 10 countries rated AAA by all three major ratings agencies. It was also critical for us to build buffers in our financial system to ensure this banking sector remained unquestionably strong. In July, our regulator announced that they would raise the minimum capital requirements for our major banks by 150 basis points to ensure they build a bigger buffer and are less susceptible to shock. As well as fiscal discipline, we are holding our banks to a higher standard of accountability and opening the gates to competition in a sector dominated by just 4 main players. Top of my agenda when I return, we'll be introducing the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which will make banks and their senior management accountable for their actions to their customers. And this will further reduce risk and change culture in the sector and ensure the customer is placed at the centre of their operations where they always should be. This is an addition to the one-stop shop. We will set up to allow customers to resolve disputes and achieve outcomes with their banks without paying for an army of lawyers. And we're also removing the prohibition on the use of the word bank by ADIs with less than 50 million in capital in a bid to bring new innovative entrants to the market. And we are moving at pace to establish an open banking regime in Australia to transform the way Australians interact with their banking system and take advantage of the big changes that are happening in financial technology. So these are the right choices we're making as a government, as a nation, and to create our opportunities and to appreciate the risks we face and to put in place the prudent buffers we believe are necessary to protect our economy and realise the better days that we now believe are ahead. And we look forward to continuing to work with our friends and partners in the United States as we continue down this road and we write the next chapter of a generation of Australia's remarkable economic growth story. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer Nason, Chairman of the AAA. So thank you very much, Treasurer Morrison, for those comments. I think we all appreciate an opportunity to get an update on the sort of current situation in Australia as it relates to the economy and other matters. I, for one, as somebody in the banking industry, find the world an incredibly complicated place right now. On the one hand, massive technology change just seeming to shift everything right now, low interest rates, and if I get in front of a client again and say this will not last, which I've been saying for 10 years now, and they just seem to get lower. And then the NASDAQ hitting record highs. Right now, every 5 days, the NASDAQ is hitting another record high. So it can be very hard to fit all the pieces together right now. So I would like to open things up for questions, and if I could, perhaps I can ask the first one, Scott. So your government has already taken significant initiative, as you pointed out, regarding tax reform and infrastructure investment. I'm wondering if you would care to comment on what the President is trying to do here, how it meshes with what we're doing in Australia and his chances of success. An easy one to get things started.
Well, I don't envy the President's task, or more importantly, the Ways and Means Committee of Congress, who has to find some way of pulling all this together. But I commend the President for his leadership on making the very simple point that we also hold dear as an economic philosophy, that if you cut the tax burden on businesses, they'll invest and they'll grow your economy, they'll boost productivity, which will lead to better wage outcomes for workers and improve the standard of living. I mean, that is an economic orthodoxy that should be affirmed, and I welcome the fact that the US administration have done that. They're not alone in that. I mean, the Brits are well ahead. They're on their way to 17%. The Macron government has taken it down to 25. The Singaporeans are already in the teens. So the idea that if you think you can be competitive and have corporate tax rates with a 3 at the front of it are long gone. And those who don't move on making a more competitive tax system risk stranding themselves on a high tax island. And that is not a place I think anyone wants to be. Now, translating those strong views and beliefs into legislative change is a difficult task in any Western democracy, particularly at a time when wages have been so flat as they have in Australia, but equally as they have here. Tax reform is always a more achievable task when wages are running at a much higher rate, because people can see their own ability to accommodate it or have their own buffers to deal with what may happen. I think electorates these days are far more savvy about what reform means. Back in the 80s and the 90s, people talked about reform and all sounded terribly exciting. These days, they know that it means one thing: this is going to hurt. And I think they're a lot more reticent, I think, to embrace those sort of reform agendas. So that makes the job hard for governments and for legislators. So look, as I did yesterday when I met with some members yesterday, I wish them Godspeed in being able to deliver this. But getting the right balance and package between personal income tax and corporate income tax, I think, is going to be very tricky. And my view would always be, if you keep it simple, it's got a better chance of success. We were able to legislate up to 50 million because the public in Australia got it, that if small businesses got more support, they were more likely to survive, and that was good for their jobs, because there was a very close connection between those who run those businesses and the people who work for them. When you get into large businesses, that connection is lost. And part of the challenge I think large companies have, and I know it's true in Australia, I wouldn't presume on what was happening here, but if large businesses aren't able to project a level of confidence to their workers that if they do well, their workers will do well, it's going to get harder to argue for tax reform. So I think business has a key role to play in supporting governments that want to reduce company taxes by making one simple point to the electorate, and that is, if we do better, you'll do better. And they have to be able to believe it, and there has to be evidence of it.
Questions from the audience? Yes, and if you could just state your name and where you're from.
Sure. Mike Newton from Processor and Sales in Citibank. Mr. Treasurer, thank you very much for your remarks. Just to be clear, are we on the record here or not?
I'm always on the record.
Okay.
Everyone's on time.
For those who don't think I've got a loud enough voice, then I've been given the mic. I just wanted to ask you what you thought about the exchange rate here, because obviously in a very, very open economy like Australia, with a major commitment to being a very active trading partner for a whole number of nations and to be very heavily involved in the free flow of capital, the RBA is obviously commenting quite a bit about the strength of the exchange rate, and it's a concern. I just wondered if you had any comments you might like to share, because this is obviously a very hot issue for markets right now.
Well, I tend not to speculate whether it's on rates or exchange rates. I mean, I said in my own remarks that when we were going through the upside of the mining boom, well, and commodity prices rising, while that was, that had its advantages, at the same time it was making life pretty difficult for other exporters. And where the exchange rate sits now, sub 80, high 70s, I mean, that seems to have been a fairly conventional place for the rate to sit, which doesn't seem to exacerbate the problems for other exporters, while at the same time, I think, creating any sort of other uncertainties for investors. So It's not the RBA's job to manage the exchange rate. They know that. They don't set their monetary policy to address those objectives. Their objectives relate to employment and inflation, and they're closely watching what's happening in both of those. But you know, our inflation, we're forecast to go back into our inflation target over the course of the next 3 years. But at the same time, we're watching what's happening with wages, which the wage price index is sitting below sub 2%, and we'd like to see that to be a bit stronger than it is right now. So what all that means for exchange rates, with traders and analysts and all the rest of those guys will give you their tuppence for it. And, but I speak, it won't cost a tuppence. But
More questions? You have a microphone. Yes, Craig, here. Just wait for the mic if you don't mind.
Hi, thanks, Scott. Craig Chapman, from Vice Chairman of the American Astronomy Association, partner at Sidley Austin. So I know you're not the immigration minister, and I know you're not the housing minister, but I do wonder, you know, here in the U.S., the demographics of our economy, the aging of the baby boomers, whether we let immigrants in or not, plays into, you know, the analysis of how well we think the economy is going to go, and factors into the financial analysis. So I just wonder how you look at that in Australia.
there are three things that have made Australia a rich nation over more than 200 years. They are immigration, trade, and foreign investment. Without those three things, Australia would not have this prosperity we enjoy today. It remains at the centre of how we continue to succeed, and so therefore we have been quite strident in being, whether it's in forums like the G20, which I'll be at tonight, or other places, we have always been the most strident voices in favour of each of these sort of things. But they've got to be done on your own terms and in national interest. And immigration, as a government, we have the strong confidence of our country because they know, we run an immigration program where we run it and the rules by which it's run. You will always get in our country support for these things, provided the government demonstrates that it's got it under control and it's being run in the country's interests. So skilled migration has always been the predominant form of our migration in Australia, particularly under governments of our persuasion. It runs at around 2/3 of the overall intake. When it falls below that, I think you get into problems with how you run your immigration program. Your population growth, we've had pretty good population growth. Our long run average is around 1.4. We're sitting currently at about 1.6. That is largely all driven by immigration, with an intake of just under 200,000 a year, or thereabouts. That's an absorbable amount. Demand and the way things work, you could see that fall as a population growth rate back to about 1.4, I suspect, over the medium term. But that is still by OECD standards for an advanced economy a very strong growth rate. But you go to places like Melbourne and they're growing at 2.5%. So around the country the growth rates are a little different. That's why the infrastructure investment is so important. But the other big population trend is on ageing. And Australia, the United States, Japan, China, this is not a unique trend. And when I often speak to older audiences, sometimes the ageing of the population is portrayed as a negative. We're all going to live longer. This is apparently a bad thing. I think it's a pretty good thing, particularly if you're getting closer to what, as we all get closer every day. But for a country like Australia, one of the most exciting things in the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement is that we can sell aged care services into China. We think that's fantastic. We see ourselves as being the world's leading provider of ageing services, and we want to expand that capability and that strength, not just in the actual development of physical properties in which they live, but also the myriad of services and systems, financial and otherwise, that are needed. You need good retirement incomes policies to support that, and we've made some changes on that front as well in the last couple of years to make it more sustainable. But population trends drive much of what governments have to deal with. And I think Australia and the US are wrestling with very similar issues on that front.
Yes, one down, just down the front here, sorry, first and then go to table Right here, right in front of me.
Oh.
Thank you.
Tom Murphy, Blue Sky. Just on a mining investment, I saw that as a percentage of GDP is down around 3% now from 9%. It looks as if it's pretty much closing in on the long-term average. How much further do you think we've got to go in terms of mining investments later? Are we pretty much through it?
No, we're through it, I'd say, and that's also what Phil Lowen has said pretty consistently. In fact, we're now starting to see it tick up a bit. With particular projects, it's very project specific, but no, I think I was about 4 months ago, I'm thinking, maybe a bit longer, that Phil first said we're about 90% of the way through. And we've seen that now happen for some time, and we've been waiting for the last 2 years to see some of that spare capacity tick up, flip over to some of the other sectors, and the last few quarters have demonstrated that, and so that was pretty pleasing to see that, particularly the non-mining sector, start to kick in. Hopefully we'll see that continue.
Have a slide. Was there a question?
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, for your comments. Magnus Morton, PwC. So just coming back to your comments earlier around the reduction in the corporate tax rate, we of course welcome that, as most people in this room would. In terms of the broader tax base, be interested in your thoughts on the case for broader reform, and you spoke about needing to have business helping advocate for such change, but there probably is a need for a longer term strategy in terms of the tax base and facilitating investment, especially in the context where we've had a bunch of recent measures which have been more onerous than helpful, I suppose, in stimulating investment, with the diverted profits tax and the MAL, and hybrids are coming, and they do have arguably disproportionate impacts on US multinationals. So just be interested to hear your thoughts on what we can do in terms of broader based reform that might help investment and encourage it into Australia.
Well, first of all, I'd say that Australia has arguably the most liberal foreign investment rules of any country in the world. We have an approval regime, but I can count on less than one hand the number of applications that have been knocked back, a very small number. And there are very specific cases that sit around the ones where that occurs. On multinationals, this is part of a broad, as you know, global position, actually driven out of the G20 and the OECD. And what I've found with multinationals since we introduced the MAL and subsequently the profits tax is that there has been a restructuring of multinationals. It was good while it lasted. The whistle's been blown on all that. It's happening in many other countries. We're sitting down with our tax administrations and working the issue out and getting on a more, I think, transparent and stable partnership as to how the tax system is going to apply. I mean, it's a fairly simple principle. Every country around the world just basically wants things that are earned there to be taxed there. And that's what we're moving towards. And the US also would like to see a lot more money come home. And that's a big part of the reform package that I think the President and the Treasury Secretary are seeking to pursue. Every single budget we make changes to our tax system. And whether it was the changes we made for capital gains tax relief, for investments, angel investments and startups, or new ventures, we've made a number of those. I mentioned some of the affordable housing ones. In terms of broad-based, expanding the base of the tax system in Australia, I mean, it's been very confined to the income side, corporate and corporate personal income. When the GST was introduced back in 2001, there was a different opportunity to pursue those sorts of changes. It was a fairly unique time in our history. I wouldn't say that the alignment of forces that are necessary to see that happen again are currently present or are foreseeable in the near term. So it is just a process, I think, of every 6 months, every 12 months, grinding out further improvements on each occasion. Another area where we're very active over the last 12 months has been doing a lot of work on the black economy in Australia. And that is where we obviously want to see the base extended into the black economy. That will be greatly assisted not only by increased compliance activities, but frankly more so by fostering the further digitalisation of our economy. And the more that everybody is using the digital system for payments, well, the harder it is for the black economy to operate. I think this is a positive trend, and Australia has the highest rate of growth in contactless payments of anywhere in the world, and I think we'll continue to see that happen. And as that happens, I think we'll see lesser defrauding of the tax system, and the more we achieve that, well, frankly, the less we have to tax the system overall. So that's an area where we think there's some fertile ground, and we're doing quite a lot of work on that at the moment.
I think we are out of time. So thank you, Treasurer Morrison. If I could have a... So before we conclude, and I'm sure you can stay for coffee and be close to you today, I would like to thank a few people. So the Treasurer for being here today and giving us his time, and we wish you a successful week here in the United States and welcome you back again in the future. I would also like to thank Jim O'Donnell and Mark Woodruff at Citi for hosting us today. They are very generous actual hosters of many of the AAA events, so thank you for that. Sarah McCarahan from Citi, who sits on our board but was not able to be here today, but also a great supporter of the AAA. Alistair Walton, our new Consul General, who is kicking up a storm here in New York, and we look forward to partnering with him and all the good folks at the Consul General here in New York. And finally, I would just like to remind all of you, if you don't already know, that the American Australian Association will be holding our annual benefit dinner on October the 24th downtown at Cipriani. We are honouring Lachlan Murdoch this year, and we are giving a Lifetime Achievement Award to Andrew Liveris. And the entertainment for the evening, to the extent this is your thing, is Harry Connick Jr., and I will tell you that is my thing. So I will be there. So we look forward to seeing you all there on the 24th. Thank you for joining us today, and Treasurer, thank you again for being our guest.